Hello and welcome to the Power Grid, the Footballguys.com DFS show. I'm your host, Austin Lee, and I'm joined, as always, by Jeff Pasquino, Ryan Hester, Devin Knotts, and John Lee. We're covering week 2 of the NFL this week, and we're only covering the main slate as usual, so we're ignoring Thursday Night Football and Monday Night Football and covering the 14 games on Sunday. So, guys, let's jump right into it. Let's go straight to Vegas. That's where we start our research every week. If you are a Football Guys Insider Pro Plus subscriber, you'll see John's Vegas value charts on our site every Tuesday to give you that jump start to your week to figure out which of these teams have a high team total as it's implied from the Vegas odds. So, John, speaking of that chart that you do every week, tell us, what is Vegas showing you this week? What games seem to be the key games of the week?
Well, I think we have to start right at the top of the chart. It's New England coming off of that very surprising loss last week to the Kansas City Chiefs. They'll look to regroup this week, and they'll head down to New Orleans to play a team that lost on Monday Night Football to the Minnesota Vikings. The total in that game is 55 points, which 2 weeks into the season is the highest total on the board, and I think we're going to see a lot of players owned out of this game, not only in cash games but in GPPs, and I'm certainly I know we're going to talk about these guys a lot more as we get through the show.
Yeah, definitely. Jeff, what else stands out to you from Vegas?
Well, there's a lot of teams that are in play with 24 or more points. It's a large number, which is kind of a little surprising considering how low the scores were in general last week and how the defenses seem to be a little bit ahead. We definitely are going to see some teams that are going to struggle in the offense, but I think that some of these we're seeing a lot of big point totals on a lot of teams that are double-digit favorites. So there's still plenty of bad teams out there. A lot of defenses to target, a lot of blowouts that are possible. But in a blowout, the team's still got to score the points. So don't be afraid to start the studs on those teams that are expected to blow people out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes people get scared off of those teams that are the heavy underdogs. Devin, what do you see when you look at the Vegas landscape this week?
Yeah, I think the one thing that you should look for is don't always just look at the over-under and just dismiss the game. So look at Oakland and the Jets. So the over-under is 43.5, which isn't something that we typically will target. But the Raiders are favored by 14 points, so their implied total is over 28. So don't just dismiss a game simply because the over/under is low. Actually, do look at the implied total, which is why it's great to look at John's report.
That's a great point. And Ryan, what else stands out to you? Any other particular games that you think are going to have a lot of DFS ownership coming out of them?
I think Minnesota and Pittsburgh should, if only, as much for the total as simply the fact that we kind of know where the production comes from those teams. Those teams, the production funnel, as it were, is pretty thin. Le'Veon Bell, Antonio Brown, Stefon Diggs, Adam Thielen, Kyle Rudolph. I mean, these teams don't have 4, 5, 6 weapons that they go to. So I think that you're going to see some ownership there.
Yeah, that's a great point. And some of these teams where it is a little fuzzier as to exactly who's going to get the DFS love, we're going to try to sift through that and make some calls for you guys so that you'll know who to play from these big-time games. 7 out of the 14 games on the main slate have a spread that's greater than a touchdown. You don't usually see that amount of lopsided matchups in a single week. So we're going to help you navigate that a little bit.
One more just to mention, since it hasn't been brought up, Green Bay and Atlanta has a total of 54.5. So it's right up there with the New Orleans-New England game in what should be one of the higher scoring games of the week.
Yeah, I agree. I think that New England-New Orleans game and the Green Bay-Atlanta game are the top two. To me, like to a slightly lesser degree, I would say the Philadelphia at Kansas City game and then the game that Ryan mentioned, the Minnesota at Pittsburgh. To me, those are the 4 that have a lot of options in them. So I want to make sure that we hit on those 4 games especially, but we're going to cover all 14 games on the main slate here. Fellas, let's move on to quarterbacks and get a couple of your guys' take on quarterbacks. And does it seem like there's a plethora of chalk plays this week? That's what I like to start off these sections with, is sort of identifying some of the chalk and then moving into some of the pivots and the GPP plays. Jeff, what do you have at quarterback this week? Is there a chalk play?
To me, the top play is Tom Brady. I think Tom Brady's he's the most rested of the quarterback on the entire list. He's got the highest implied total. Picking out which receiver to target for the Patriots is always difficult, so why not take the quarterback who's going to distribute the ball to all of them? And then you can get pieces of the other games at the other positions. That, to me, is the chalk play.
Yeah, that's a great call, and I think Brady is the one that stands out to me as the chalkiest play. Devin, what other quarterbacks stand out to you, maybe as like a GPP play, or a couple other guys you think will be heavily owned?
Yeah, I think on DraftKings you have to look at Blake Bortles and Jared Goff. So Blake Bortles is only $4,400, and Jared Goff is only $5,100. Goff threw for 300 yards in a season opener. It was against the Colts. So, yes, we can't fully validate that he's significantly improved now that they didn't have Vontae Davis. But at the same time, you're getting a quarterback at 5,100. That bar to actually exceed value is so much lower, especially on DraftKings where the pricing is a little bit tight. For instance, going with a Tom Brady, he's $7,900, so you get $2,800 in savings there. Blake Bortles is only $4,400, so yes, they didn't run the ball last week, but we've seen Blake Bortles in non-extremely difficult matchups perform. So he's always struggled with Houston, so it's not that big of a surprise that he had a bad game. Going up against Tennessee, which is a significantly better matchup than what he had last week, so he should be throwing the ball a little bit more this week.
Yeah, and I think with GPPs, you sort of have to take some of those kind of risks. I probably feel better about Goff than I do about Bortles, but he's even cheaper than Goff. John, you waved the black-eyed Joes. What is your take on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually just have more of a question for Devin as he talks about this. Doing a roster build this week with a cheap quarterback like that, who are you pairing him up with on the higher end of the scale without David Johnson, with Le'Veon Bell with a questionable matchup? Even Ezekiel Elliott has a tough matchup there in Denver. I wonder where you're spending the money if you're going with a guy like Bortles, who I love for GPPs. Yeah. I'm just not so sure I love him for cash games.
Yeah, I think that in cash it's a little bit questionable. The route that I would go is Julio Jones and Robin Gronkowski with some Brandon Cooks. So it gives you the exposure. You can also get Jordy Nelson in there too. So it gives you exposure to the Falcons, Green Bay, New England, New Orleans games, and you can game stack those types of games if you go cheap at quarterback.
Yeah, I think that's the play. I think that if you don't go cheap in some other areas, you're probably playing a lot of those mid-range receivers. There's quite a few good mid-range receiver options that we'll mention during our receivers segment. But, paying up for someone like Gronk, Julio, Jordy, that's where I'm spending too if I'm going cheap at quarterback. Now, tell me, I'm going to kick this to you, Ryan. We've got a little bit more time on our quarterbacks here. Are there any other of these sort of like high-end quarterbacks that you might consider playing in cash instead of Tom Brady?
Yeah, I think any of them in any of the main four we talked about, but I kind of have my eye on Matt Ryan a little bit. We get Julio Jones, we get the fast surface, we get the Green Bay defense in a potential shootout. I think Devin and I have more to talk about on this game based on the red black-eyed Joe I see there. But I still like them returning home. I still think he's a good candidate for 300 yards and multiple TDs anytime they're in their home stadium.
Yeah. What did you want to add something there, Devin? You don't.
Yeah. The one concern that I have with Matt Ryan is the pace of play that the Falcons had last week. So they ran a play every 32.5 seconds, which is by far the slowest. In the first half, they ran a play every 36 seconds, which is, they almost have to be intentionally playing that slow. So I don't know if it's a Super Bowl change in philosophy where they're trying not to wear out their defense. That's a concern for me if Ryan's not throwing 40-plus times, if they're just trying to keep the number of possessions down per game.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point there. I don't think it scares me off of Julio Jones and playing him.
Correct.
It does make me a little bit I don't know. I'm really watching this to see if it's a trend or if that was a one-game thing.
Julio Jones, I have no concerns with. And in GPPs, I have no concerns with Matt Ryan either. The concern is in cash game based on the pricing that he's not cheap. He's a very highly priced quarterback based on that total. So for me, I'm deviating a little bit and going in a different direction. I'd rather pay up for Tom Brady than Matt Ryan, for example.
Yeah, and I'd probably rather pay up for Aaron Rodgers in cash than I would Matt Ryan.
Sure.
But, there's a lot of good options at the top. I'm not saying Matt Ryan is a terrible option. It's just that pace is something to keep an eye on this week. One other guy that I'm considering more for GPP play would be Jameis Winston. We didn't get to see him last week, and he's got a decently high implied total against the Bears this week with 25 points. I think he's going to be lower owned than some of these higher priced quarterbacks. And so Winston is a guy that I'll have some exposure to this week. John, did you have
pair him with Evans?
What's that?
Always pair him with Evans.
Yeah, always stacking with Evans. And that's a stack I like. We've got a section later where we're going to talk about more stacks, but that's definitely one of the stacks I'll be looking at this week in GPPs. John, did you have another quarterback you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I actually have two other quarterbacks I want to talk about in terms of game strategy and GPPs. Two guys this week that I think you have to consider. Number one is Russell Wilson, coming off of that really bad performance against Green Bay last week. These guys have a 28-point implied team total, and they're 2-touchdown favorites. So I think what's going to happen is a lot of people are going to try to find the sleeper running back on the Seahawks. And guess what? There ain't a sleeper running back on the Seahawks. I actually think a lot of this scoring is going to come through Russell Wilson to a guy like Jimmy Graham, to a guy like Doug Baldwin. And so I think that he'll be under-owned because if you're going to spend up at quarterback, it's likely going to be one of the guys you have already talked about. And for the same reasons, and I won't go into any more detail than that, I also like Derek Carr this week because he's got a 28.75 implied team total. And again, the same parameters fit. I think the high price is going to scare people away. If they're going to be paying that much, it'll go towards Brady or Breeze or Rodgers. And they think game script wise, they're not going to get their points. But if they jump out to 3 or 4 touchdowns in the first half, it doesn't matter if they run the ball in the second half because they will have gotten their points by that point in time.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about big spreads potentially scaring off people from these guys in cash, but it shouldn't scare you off for GPPs. They're still very much in play. Let's talk about some running backs. We've got a lot of different sort of injury situations, and we've learned some things after seeing the running backs play in week 1. First off, David Johnson is going to be out for a very long time. So the Arizona backfield is something that we may want to take a look at. And then Danny Woodhead is also out. And so the Ravens backfield is something that's been mixed up a little bit here. Devin, are any of those injury situations something that are interesting to explore for DFS this week, or is there another play you're looking at?
Yeah, I'm not really targeting any of those running backs. I think that, Buck Allen might be interesting with the Woodhead injury, but it's not a situation that I'm really enamored by. I think the one guy, and I do the rushing matchups for Football Guys, we go game by game, basically breaking down as well as passing matchups on our site. So the one thing that I love this week is Marshawn Lynch. So Darren Lee is playing inside linebacker for the Jets this week, and he played last week. They released David Harris in the offseason. Darren Lee's 210 pounds. He's giving up 20 to 25 pounds to Marshawn Lynch. And he graded out horribly last week in run defense. He's more of a pass rush type guy that's really out of position. So Marshawn Lynch, if he gets to that second level, he's at least getting another couple yards because Darren Lee or Demario Davis are not bringing him down on first contact.
Yeah, I like that pick. I'm right on the fence as to whether I like Marshawn for cash or not. I definitely like him in GPPs. You feel confident, though, about having him in cash this week?
First game in Oakland.
Yeah.
So they're going to try and get him a touchdown. You know that coming home to Oakland, and I'm not a big narrative guy, but play calling, he came out of retirement in front of his home crowd. The crowd loves him. I'm in on that narrative.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard not to buy into some of these narratives. And he did get a pretty high percentage of playing time this past week,
Absolutely.
More than we saw in terms of like this 3-headed monster we saw last year with Latavius Murray. So I think that Lynch is more of a bona fide back than last year's situation. So I like him this week, especially as a 2-touchdown favorite.
And he almost scored last week too. So it was close. It's coming.
Yeah, it's definitely coming. Jeff, tell me, what do you see as the chalk this week at running back? Marshawn Lynch, I feel like, is sort of like borderline chalk for me, but are there a couple other guys you think will be higher owned in cash?
I think on FanDuel, a lot of people are going to be looking at, Bell because Johnson's out, so you go with the other key back. But Melvin Gordon is pretty much the top for me. I think that he was used in both ways, the effectiveness as a receiver and a rusher. First home game for the Chargers in L.A., not that they're going to have a big crowd, but I think that he's pretty well up there. And on both sides, I think Ty Montgomery is the other chalk play, which I know that Ryan wants to speak to, but the game script is going to dictate that he gets the ball in any way, and it's a high-scoring game.
Yeah, Ryan, tell us about your man crush on Ty Montgomery this week.
Well, it goes back to the preseason when we had a couple plant a flag articles on the site, and I was the pro Montgomery guy with some anti Montgomery. But the anti Montgomery guys said that he might not be the feature back. He might not be a huge part of the offense. Well, last week he played 74 out of 82 snaps, which 74 was the most of any running back in the league. So he's on the field. He got all 4 running back targets for Green Bay. He got all but 2 carries for Green Bay. And so his distribution of touches may change. Green Bay may not run as much against other opponents as they do against Seattle. But so that just means he's going to get more targets. And I'll trade 2 carries for a target every time. The numbers bear out that fantasy points per target are more valuable or is a higher number than fantasy points per rush. None of this factors in the this week part of it, which is Atlanta. Atlanta allowed 14.5 receptions per game last year. They let 14.5 receiving fantasy points per game to running backs. Not receptions. 14.5 receiving fantasy points to running backs.
Right.
We saw what James White did in the Super Bowl. That was a huge display. We saw what Tariq Cohen, waiver wire extraordinaire, did last week. And he and Jordan Howard had 23.1 receiving points, and Howard dropped an end zone target. So Atlanta's not good against running backs in the receiving game. It's going on a 3-year trend now. Montgomery is a receiving back. He plays all the time. He's in a game with a high total. I just think the stars align for him, and he's only 5,800 on DraftKings. So I don't know why you wouldn't put him in.
Yeah, and so just for the audio audience, it was a unanimous green black-eyed Joe for Marshawn Lynch. There was lots of green black-eyed Joe for Melvin Gordon. And I know I'm on the green for Ty Montgomery as well, but I know one guy here does not buy into the Ty Montgomery hype. Devin, tell me why not?
I don't hate Ty Montgomery, but I'm not enamored by him. So it's not. I have nothing against him. I think on DraftKings, maybe as a flex, he's fine. But the concern I have is we've seen over the last couple of years that the Packers focus primarily running the ball against the Seahawks. James Starks in 2015 had 20 carries, 4 receptions. He was the talk. Everyone had to pick him up. Played the Chiefs the next week, the 49ers the following week. He had 60 total yards. So you never really can feel comfortable with the Packers running back. We've learned that over the years. Every time Eddie Lacy has a big game, it seems like he fell off. So I just can't buy into the fact that the Packers running backs, especially we've seen volume in Seattle be the highest it's been against any team. In cash, I probably won't have a lot of shares.
Yeah, you're concerned about that volume falling off. Ryan, any rebuttal?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would just ask, maybe that's kind of a good season-long perspective, but this matchup is good, is it not? Do you not think the matchup's good? Or is it more just the player and the team?
The matchup's good, but there's a lot of running backs that have great matchups. Kareem Hunt has a good matchup. Marshawn Lynch has a good matchup. Jeff mentioned Melvin Gordon. I want more consistency. I don't want to be frustrated on Sunday when he throws a 2-yard slant to Jordy Nelson for a touchdown, or Aaron Rodgers runs the ball for. I just don't like going with Packers running backs, particularly because there's so many weapons in that offense that we just don't know how the ball's going to be distributed.
Yeah, I think those are good arguments on both sides. I think that there's some other pass-catching backs that you could consider if you're looking to save a little bit more cash instead of Ty Montgomery, especially in GPPs. I think that a lot of people are going to be heavy on Jacquizz Rodgers this week. because he feels like he's going to be the quote-unquote featured back with Doug Martin out. But I actually like Sims more in this game because Jacquizz Rodgers' success last season was when Sims was hurt. And so I like the pass-catching ability of Sims in that game a little bit more. Although John disagrees. Tell me, John, do you like Jacquizz here?
I don't like any of them. Stay away from the running game. That's all I wanted to say. Go to the passing game. I think as time rolls around and we get more data on these teams, I actually think that Chicago is fairly stout up front and they're bad in the secondary. They're going to be a funnel defense in a few weeks, but get ahead of the punch and just get Jameis Winston and Mike Evans into your lineups this weekend and fade Quiz at fairly high ownership.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely you want to fade Quiz here. I think other guys that I like even more are Alvin Kamara of the Saints, if you're looking for a pass-catching back who he got 50% of the snaps last week. And I think that on DraftKings, we mentioned the Chicago running back,
Tariq Cohen, and I think that at 4,100 over on DraftKings, he is also in play here, especially in GPPs. I think the game script sets up decently for him. They'll be playing from behind, but Devin disagrees. You don't like Cohen this week, Devin. I mean, not Devin, Ryan.
I would just rather have James White for a pretty similar price point.
And James White is another one worth considering. So instead of Cohen, you'd like White. I like Kamara and White quite a bit, but those are some names that you can consider if you're looking for cheap pass-catching backs, especially in full point.
Can we talk about Kareem Hunt this week?
Yeah, we should.
Yeah.
Definitely.
What do you think, Devin? What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, how can you not he's going to be one of, if not the most popular guy this week. Using him in the offense, I know that he's probably not going to be – he's not going to have 3 touchdowns and 200-plus yards. So let's get that out of the way right away.
Right.
But at the same time, this is a guy who was utilized in the rushing game, passing game. We thought Charkandrick West might get some carries. He had 1 carry at the end of the game. This backfield is Hunt's. I mean, it's absolutely his backfield. And he's a guy that I think in cash games you have to at least consider. GPPs, I think he's maybe a smart fade because the teams are planning around him this week.
Yeah, he's a guy that I like a little bit more than Marshawn Lynch in cash if I can afford him. He's a little bit pricier, but I'm probably not going to have both Hunt and Lynch in my cash lineup, so I'm generally going with Hunt in those situations. All right, let's move on to wide receivers. We've got some injuries here that may shift the landscape of DFS this week. The one I have my eye on the most is probably Danny Amendola in that Patriots-Saints game. He did not practice on Thursday, and he's dealing with both a concussion and a knee injury. And if we know anything about Danny Amendola, he's not exactly a fast healer here, so I'm expecting him not to play this week, but keep an eye on that situation. We've also got John Brown of the Cardinals, who didn't practice on Thursday either. He's got a quad issue, and he's also had some trouble coming back from injuries recently. A couple of guys who are out, Allen Robinson with a torn ACL for the Jags, and Kevin White with a broken scapula for the Bears. So let me kick this over to you, John. Any of these injuries create a situation in DFS where there's a cheap guy that you're looking to put into lineups?
Yeah, the one guy, it's apropos that you came to me and this wasn't planned, but he shares our last name, and that's Marqise Lee. 3,800 on DraftKings this week. He's one of our better values. Going against a Tennessee Titans secondary that has not been good for some time. Gave up a few passing touchdowns last week, and if it weren't for a drop pass by Amari Cooper, it would have been 3 touchdown passes last week. So he's certainly one that I think benefits from this injury to Allen Robinson last week. And, at the upper end, I just get these out of the way so the rest of them don't have to talk about them. We've already said Julio Jones, Jordy Nelson, these are guys that you need to be thinking about. Antonio Brown is really expensive this week. I think on a full PPR site like DraftKings, though, he's probably still in play because he's almost unstoppable, as he showed last week with 180 yards or whatever he had. He's just incredible.
Do you have any concerns about Brown facing the Vikings defense? I mean, I'm sure that makes him not a cash play, but does it concern you at all?
Yeah, I mean, it does to some degree. Xavier Rhodes is he's a really good defensive back, but how often has Antonio Brown been shut down by any defensive back in this league? He's made Joe Hayden his stepchild throughout his career, and I think nobody was happier to sign with the Steelers than Joe Hayden there a few weeks ago. So, I think if there's anybody that's matchup proof from the wide receiver position, it probably is Brown.
Yeah, and I think that will scare a lot of ownership away from him, which makes him a strong GPP play this week. Jeff, who else do you see as the chalk plays, or who else are you eyeing here at wide receiver?
I do like Julio a lot. I think that Chris Hogan has to be in play. I think I actually like him a little bit more on FanDuel just because the value and the pricing is a little bit better on FanDuel for him, which is usually a little odd to go receiver there more. I'm kind of steering away. I'm trying to get a little bit piece of all the big games. So I like Tyreek Hill for Kansas City. I think that's going to be a good play this week. They're going to want to get the ball in his hands. It's a speedy defense for the Eagles, and he can beat them with even more speed. I also like the Minnesota wide receivers. I think both Diggs and Thielen are going to be very much in play. That's going to be the Pittsburgh-Minnesota game is going to be very interesting to me. I don't like the line at all. I think Minnesota, just for the point spread followers out there, the Minnesota +6 feels off to me. But Minnesota looked really well, and Pittsburgh didn't look they looked kind of flat. So I'm leaning against Antonio Brown for that very reason, because Antonio Brown had a big game last week. So normally Pittsburgh tries to be a little bit more balanced. I think they're going to notice that Le'Veon Bell was not happy, not in the full game script things. They'll probably get him more involved this week in the passing game, and maybe even some Rodgers game as well. I know Minnesota's good in the defense that way, but they're still going to get him involved.
Ryan, you're the resident Steelers fan here. You've flashed up the red black-eyed Joe. What's your take?
I don't think they care how Le'Veon Bell feels. He held out of camp. They were mad. I mean, if you watched the game closely last week, maybe Devin, being the Browns fan, did as well. It was almost like they sort of punished Le'Veon Bell. He didn't get the ball for a couple series. They threw very east-west, a lot of short stuff. The first drive was 3 screen passes instead of handing off to Bell. They threw 2 touchdowns to Jesse James. One was on a bubble screen from the 2. I think they weren't real pleased with it. Roethlisberger's comments suggested as much. And we all know, hashtag Big Ben at home. And Antonio Brown is basically cornerback proof, as we talked about. And Big Ben doesn't care. He still throws at those number 1 corners because he knows his guy's going to go get it.
Yeah, and Jeff mentioned the Minnesota receivers. I think that choosing between those 2 guys is a big decision for a lot of people in cash games. Since those 2 guys played on Monday night, both of their prices are kind of depressed compared to the big games that they had. I'm more on the Thielen side of things if I get a little bit of that savings. Who's on the Thielen side? Show me your black-eyed Joes here, as opposed to Diggs. You like Thielen? Ryan's kind of on the fence here. I think this is a tough call. Jeff, tell me, you've got a little red, a little green. What's your take?
Yeah, I'm leaning more towards Thielen for the bigger plays. So I'm more likely to use him on FanDuel, where I would use Diggs for the PPR on DraftKings.
Gotcha. I think more people are going to flock to Diggs because he had those 2 touchdowns. Yep. And I would rather maybe go the lesser ownership of Thielen because he had the yardage in that game. But I don't know, Ryan, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, a couple things. But, when I need the savings, I'm happy to take Thielen. But, when I can get Diggs and I can, and it's more of a cash GPP thing. Diggs is probably safer in cash. And then to your point, the ownership leads me to Thielen. And one last thing on Bell. I don't think he's a bad play. I just wanted to say I don't think the Steelers really care about his feelings enough to drive a narrative that direction. They are a 6-point favorite. They are at home. Should they be winning the game, he'll be carrying the ball at the end. So just a clarification.
Yep. And speaking of Narrative Street, we have to mention Brandon Cooks this week going up against his old team, playing for the Patriots against the Saints. He's going to be a very popular play this week. And I think with Angry Brady throwing to him, we can anticipate a big game for Cooks. Yeah, this is all, it's like oozing with the narrative.
Devontae Harris is a bigger reason why he'll have a big game besides Angry Brady.
Yes, and that's the real takeaway here. But I think Cooks is going to be a popular play, as he should be, both in cash and in GPPs. Let's see. Any other receivers that someone has on their mind? Ryan, hit me with a receiver.
Keenan Allen. I'm basically on team 5,800 this week on DraftKings. Ty Montgomery, Keenan Allen, and we didn't mention Phil Rivers, but he's decent for that price too earlier. But Keenan Allen over last 18 full games has over 10 targets a game. That's 0.2 of a target less than Antonio Brown over his last 18 games.
Yeah, those 18 games.
Was that like 10 years for him?
Yeah, it might be his whole career. But when you hit the green plus sign, he will be healthy. I can't guarantee it till the end of the game. I'm just teasing
you. I agree, it's a good play. It was too good.
It was on a tee for everybody. But when you hit the green plus sign, he'll be healthy. We can't promise the rest.
That's the nice thing about DFS is that you don't have to bake in Keenan Allen's likelihood that he'll play a full season. He just has to make it through one game.
Well, more to throw out there. So Michael Thomas, we know it's going to be a high-scoring game. The Saints' offense did not look good week one, so the ownership is probably going to be driven down because of it. Who else are they going to throw to? They could throw to Ginn deep. We might talk about Fleener here in a second, but realistically, Michael Thomas is a nice contrarian play for a rebound game. There's a reason he went in high second round, low first round, late first round in a lot of fantasy season-long leagues. The guy's immensely talented, so he's a guy that could be a little sneaky this week.
Yeah, and I think he's worth a play in GPPs. I'm staying away from him in cash.
Absolutely.
Just because I'm a little concerned the Patriots are going to game plan for him, which they may not be able to do because, Breeze and Thomas are talented players here. But if I was the Patriots, that's the guy I'd want to take out of the game.
So if they game plan for him, Ted Ginn?
I'm thinking as we transition to the tight ends, John hates Ted Ginn. It's just that simple. Ted Ginn could come into play here, but I think that Coby Fleener could come into play as a tight end. Let's take a look at some tight ends. He is crazy cheap on DraftKings, especially at only $3,100. John, are you willing to play Coby Fleener for $3,100 in cash?
As we're sitting here talking and I'm listening to everybody, I'm building a cash game lineup for DraftKings, and I can tell you that Coby Fleener is currently occupying the tight end spot in this cash game lineup. So, yes, I think he's definitely a play there. He's 5,300 over on FanDuel. I think he's still playable there, but I prefer him on the DraftKings side of things. This is a tough position this week. There's not a whole lot to like. The better guys are more expensive, and I think you're going to struggle to put together a roster you like without Coby Fleener for cash games on DraftKings.
I'm thinking maybe Charles Clay here.
Absolutely.
Over Coby Fleener. It's close, but I feel more confident in Charles Clay. What do you got there, Devin? I
was going to mention Charles Clay. So in the passing matchups that I write up, and I mentioned them briefly, he had 9 of the 28 targets last week. So the Panthers have allowed the second most fantasy points to opposing tight ends in 2016. It's hard to know if they've improved because they faced George Kittle in the 49ers last week. So it's TBD whether or not to be determined whether they've improved or not. But Charles Clay has a more consistent volume, I feel, and he's the same price. So he's a guy that I like Fleener and GPPs, although he'll be popular. But Clay is a guy that I have in my cash games right now.
You got a team total there of about 17 points. You have a much better linebacking core against Carolina. And I'll point out that even though he had 9 targets last week, he pulled in 4 of them. So I don't know that it's as clear-cut as maybe Devin just made it out to be there. I think there's definitely a debate to be had.
There's a debate to be had. I feel like this is one of those guys where I am not going to shy away from him just because the implied total is low, because I think a lot of the offense goes through this tight end here. So, Ryan, are you going to be playing Rob Gronkowski in this week, either in cash or GPPs? This might be a week where it actually feels a little softer than week one, and I'm finding myself with a little extra cash sometimes, especially in my GPP lineups. Yeah, I'm making it rain. Are you thinking about using that extra cash on someone like Gronkowski?
It's tough. He didn't look great last week. I know that was Eric Berry, but to me, it's just GPP only for him because I think roster construction, at least the way I've been building cash lineups, I'd rather have high-priced guys at other positions. I'd rather have the Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady. We talked about Julio Jones. So it's just hard to jam all those high-priced guys in there. So for me, it would probably be a GPP thing with Gronk. But I don't know. The cheap options seem too appealing, so I won't have too much.
Yeah, I'll probably have him in GPPs. You mentioned Eric Berry there, which I think is worth bringing up. He shut down Gronk last week, but he's out with a ruptured Achilles, which I think puts Zach Ertz into play this week. So don't sleep on Zach Ertz. I think most people aren't going to sleep on Ertz because he had a solid game here and he was highly owned last week. So Ertz is also worth considering. No. Did Jeff say no to Ertz? Tell me more.
I just think that people are going to overlook him because of his price tag. They're going to look at the Fleener at 3,100 and not even bother with Ertz for 53. That's a big leap up to that in price tag.
That's fair. It could maybe because of the price, it scares them off. But as an Eagles fan, you feel good about Ertz.
I feel very good about the Eagles in general this week. I think that they're going to get overlooked in general on their great GPP plays.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
All right, guys, let's move on to our defenses and our kickers. We're going to go through this section a little quicker than our other sections. Show me the black guy Joes. Who wants to talk about either a defense or a kicker this week?
Start with me because I'll be quick.
John wants to talk about a defense or a kicker? Stop the press. I didn't even see what anyone else held up. I'm sorry. I know that Jeff wants to. Ryan and Devin, did you know? Ryan, did you say yes or no? Okay, so Ryan's going to. John, what do you got?
All that I wanted to say is, I mean, if the listeners and the viewers are anything like me, they didn't have a great week last week, and I basically made 4 cash game lineups, and in 2 of them I did not have one of the big 3 defenses, those being Baltimore, Jacksonville, or the Rams. If you didn't have those guys last week, they were all chalky, by the way. If you didn't have them, you probably didn't win because it was such a low-scoring week, and those defenses made up such a large portion of the overall makeup in terms of a winning roster. And for that reason, I think the chalk this week is going to be extremely overowned. I think teams like Seattle, teams like Oakland are going to be really, really highly owned. And in cash games, I'm fine with that. But for GPPs, I highly advise anybody listening or watching to really consider getting away from those defenses and going for a different team, maybe like a Chargers team going against Jay Cutler, throwing for the first time in a long time at a much reduced price and lower ownership. And I'm done talking about defenses and kickers.
Clearly, John didn't listen to me last week when I begged him to start the Jaguars D because of how cheap they were.
But I like that. Fight against the recency bias, right? We do it all the time in DFS. Always fight against that recency bias. Ryan, what's your pick?
Well, John mentioned the Raiders, and it's just a cash game play. I mean, it's just anybody playing the Jets, right? So we got to give them consideration, particularly home and big favorite. Also, Baltimore's defense, and this is kind of a real football thing, they're good. Really, really talented, really good team. These Steelers-Ravens games, that I look forward to every year might go back to the old school slobber knockers a little bit, but they also have a good matchup this week in particular. Favored against Cleveland. Deshaun Kaiser holds the ball longer than Ben Roethlisberger, which is saying something. That's a lot of sacks, and Baltimore's going to be ready.
Yep, I think you're right. Jeff, guide us through some kickers this week. No one's mentioned any kickers yet.
Oh, kickers. There's a lot of kickers this week that are in play because we got so many high point totals. But there's 3 guys I'm really looking at, 4 actually. But my number 1 guy is Blair Walsh. I think that in Seattle's going to score a lot of points, home kicker, more than 24 points. And he's modestly priced. Second one is Gostkowski. I think, again, the way to play in New England and to get a piece of the entire offense is take the kicker because he's going to get plenty of points. The third one I go with is Tavecchio for Oakland. I think that, again, Oakland's going to score plenty of points and be kicking a lot of field goals to ice it on the second half. But my GPP play is Phil Dawson with Arizona. I still think that the Colts are bad. That Arizona is going to struggle putting the ball in the red zone and into the end zone. So I think Dawson's going to get plenty of field goal opportunities.
Yeah, I think
is he my Matt Bryant from last year where you're just going to say Phil Dawson every week?
He's 3 in a row.
Working there. He's working there.
Exactly. I like it. All right, fellas, let's talk about stacks. Maybe you saved up some wide receiver or quarterback plays here that you didn't get to mention earlier, or maybe you've got a running back defense combo that you like as a stack. Devin, let me kick it to you first. Who is the stack you're playing? And tell us, I think we're talking mostly about GPP stacks here. So I know some people like to stack in cash games a little bit, but tell me about a GPP stack you've got.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned it a couple of times to this show, but Jameis Winston and Mike Evans are my favorite stack this week, going up against the Bears defense, which John talked about how good they are up front. And Evans gets I don't know if there's another receiver who gets the volume of targets that Evans does. So make sure that, when you're stacking, you're getting a guy who, the worst thing that could happen is the quarterback goes off to a different receiver. If Jameis Winston goes off, unless he goes to Cameron Brate, who else is he going to go to? So, and I do like Cameron Brate this week, but that's a side note.
Cool. John, tell me about a stack that you're excited about.
Well, I don't know that I'm excited about, I love the same stack that Devin just mentioned. And I could give you like Derek Carr, and Crabtree, which I think is one to be excited about. I think I'll go back, though, to what I talked about last week in my article, and that's Jared Goff. I think that he's going to be a much better player, a much improved player this year. And, this week they're going to go up against Washington, who has one good cornerback, and that's Josh Norman, who did not shadow anybody last week, as we thought he was going to shadow Alshon Jeffrey. I think the way you build your lineups this week in GPPs, if you want to be contrarian, is to spend down a quarterback and build your rosters opposite. That's not to suggest that Brady's a bad GPP play, for the record. I'll have plenty of him. But to be contrarian, I think a guy like Jared Goff and teaming him up with either Sammy Watkins or Cooper Kupp, who might be my new favorite NFL player, really makes a lot of sense from a game strategy perspective.
Yeah, I actually don't want to own too much Brady in GPPs just because I think he's going to have such a high ownership. But I like the Kupp pairing with Goff there. And I like that you said Crabtree with Carr instead of Cooper with Carr. That's who I'm going with as well. But I think more people are going to be on Cooper if they're stacking the Raiders there. Jeff, give me a stack you like.
Well, I'm going to go the other side of that same game that John mentioned, and I think that Terrell Pryor is going to get way overlooked this week, and I think that Kirk Cousins is going to be very low owned, and that's a good stack that's going to be not many people are on, and it fits the motif of having a cheap quarterback. The other quarterback pairing I like, I mentioned earlier, Philadelphia. Carson Wentz had a great game last week. I like him with both Kelsey. I'm sorry, not Kelsey. Ertz. Kelsey's good too, but the other side of the team, Ertz, and I also like Nelson Aguilar, who scored a touchdown last week and almost scored a second. He got tripped up in free space with about at the 5-yard line. He would have had a second one and gone in. One more GPP because this is a running back defense pair, which hasn't been really mentioned at all. I like Ezekiel Elliott for low ownership, and I like the Dallas defense. I don't trust Trevor Siemian. I think that he looked okay last week, but I think the Dallas defense is pretty darn good, and I think that Zeke can score a couple touchdowns for you. That's the way to beat the Broncos.
Yeah, that's a good point. Beat them on the ground. Ryan, I don't think we've heard any stacks from you. These guys have mentioned a lot. Do you have anything else that's kind of slipped through the cracks here?
Sure, I do. This isn't necessarily super contrarian for a huge GPP, but a single entry type or a 3-entry max type. We talked earlier, I think it was John mentioned trying to find the Seattle sleeper running back. Well, Seattle's running game is Russ Wilson to Doug Baldwin this week. And you can even pair them with Seattle's defense, which kind of goes against being contrarian at defense. But, if we're talking a team that's going to score a lot of points and be ahead, making their defense a good play, that's a good one too. Also worth noting that, we have a couple of articles on the site that are projecting GPP ownership that our guy Steve Buzzard does, and they're excellent. Just real easy to read little charts. He's projecting Ben Roethlisberger for a 3% DraftKings ownership and Antonio Brown for 9%. Whenever you can get those guys at home for under 10, I think you got to have some shares. I might be overhyping Brown here against a tough matchup, but we've seen him do it before. Last year, Julio Jones went off against Carolina, who everybody thought was a tough matchup. So it can happen. These guys are elite for a reason, and you should want some shares at a lower ownership.
Yeah, I think those are all good options, guys. Now we get to move into our parting thoughts, our words of wisdom, our last bit of advice, or any players that maybe you didn't get to mention in the other sections. Devin, I'm going to kick it to you first. Tell me, what are your parting thoughts for the show?
Yeah, parting thoughts. I think that we're still in this kind of weird, unknown period. So I scale it back a little bit. I actually scale it back more than week one, just because the amount of overreaction that I typically do for my own personal self. So I went a little bit bigger in week one. I'm going to scale that back a little bit. I had a good week one. We just don't know how good some of these defenses are. So just be careful. It's a long season. Be careful, and you don't want to lose a significant portion of your bankroll early on.
Yeah, and we've got some good bankroll management articles for free on our DFS landing page. You can find that at footballguys.com/DFS. It's kind of in the bottom right-hand corner. John, tell us your words of wisdom and parting thoughts for the week.
Not many words of wisdom left. I think we covered a lot of ground in this hour. I think one guy I have in my notes here, I'm fading Jason Witten this week against Denver. I don't know how popular he will be, but he was fairly popular last week against the Giants, and I don't know, maybe that was more matchup based. I'm fading him. Maybe what I'll say is I'll plug my own stuff. Saturday afternoon, you can inspect on the site my piece, tips and picks. Spent a lot of time writing it. I want lots of folks reading it, so I'll plug it now. It's expected Saturday afternoon. I put a lot of time into it.
And that covers the DraftKings side, right? And then David Dodds has sort of the counterpart article for the FanDuel side. So definitely check out that pairing of sort of flagship articles that pop up on Saturday mornings. Ryan, what are your parting thoughts for the week?
Yeah, we kind of glazed over it in the injury section, but I like John Brown if he plays. Indy gave up a lot of deep yardage last week, and if he doesn't, J.J. Nelson's only 3,800, so good guy to keep an eye on. And also Ty Montgomery 3X.
Okay. I have no hair left to shave off, or I'd make a bet with you.
We'll get a bet at some point. We're going to figure out something by mid-season here that's going to involve something embarrassing. Jeff, you close us out on parting thoughts.
Sure, I'll give a thought, and then I'll give my own plug. But as far as putting lineups this week, definitely want to get a piece of the bigger scoring games and look for players that are going to be heavily involved no matter what the game script. Like Ty Montgomery, Kareem Hunt, the guys that are going to be in part of the rushing and the passing games. So that the quarterbacks, those kinds of guys, the guys that are going to be probably high volume touch guys. That's what you want. I agree with Devin, though, that it is still a tricky part of the season, so be careful. And speaking of the FanDuel side of things, I'll be putting out my GPP article, which touches on a little bit of the cash, but mostly we're talking about the GPP plays and how to manage some of the game theory that the chalk plays, which ones there are, and when to fade Brady if he's going to be highly owned and so on. So that'll be out Friday or Saturday this week.
Yeah, and we've got about 20 or so articles each week that we post on our DFS landing page. So check that out over at footballguys.com. The season-long subscription, like the subscription for all of our DFS content for the season, is only $44.95. That actually gets you all the content on the site, all of our season-long fantasy stuff, our Dynasty, IDP, and all of the DFS stuff that we post on the site. So for less than $45 for the whole season, check that out over at footballguys.com. Includes tools, projections, ownership percentages, you name it, it's over there. So I appreciate all of you listening and watching to our Week 2 episode. On behalf of the incredible Mr. Devin Knotts, the well-groomed Ryan Hester, the expressive Jeff Pasquino, and to John Lee, nothing compares to you. I'm Austin Lee saying thank you for watching and thanks for being a football guy.